the origins of the Sephardi and Ashkenazi customs. Basically, the oral tradition, which was disseminated and preserved by the rabbinical leadership, by divine providence, followed the Jews. Some ended up in North Africa. Others ended up in France. And then because of the Christian Islamic wars for control over Europe, there was a break. All contact would be suspect as espionage. So we had the mesorah continuing, the oral tradition continuing in these two parts of the world with very little communication between them. When there finally was a realization that there were now two sets of customs. It was the same Torah. The basics were all the same. But there were differences in some of the details and the culture. It was the European culture that was the basis for what was then the Tzarfatim, the Frenchies, who later became the Ashkenazim. And it was the Middle Eastern culture that was really the greatest influence on the North African, the Sephardi culture. It's very, very interesting. What I'm going to be sharing with you now is a detail, but I think it's a very important detail for when you do eventually study these works, because it's not so well known and there are many misunderstandings on the basis of it. The names I mentioned, the source to the, pretty much the source to the North African transmission of the oral law was Rabbeinu Hananel, to Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, Yosef Magash, the Ri Magash, Rabbeinu Maimon, Rambam. It originated with Rabbeinu Hananel. What later became the Ashkenazi one really began with Rabbeinu Gershom in France, who taught Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar, who was the Rebbe of Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, Rashi. Now, Rashi had no sons, he had 5 daughters. His sons-in-law and grandchildren are known as the Balei HaTosafos. Rashi wrote an extensive commentary to everything there is pretty much in Jewish literature. And the Balei HaTosafos wrote the additional commentaries. In the Tosafos, one will often find the opinion of Rabbeinu Hananel, to the point that one who does not know much history, but is getting all his information from just the names that are flashing in front of him when he's reading, will think that Rabbeinu Hananel was one of the Balei HaTosafos. Rabbeinu Hananel, once again, he lived in Rome, but he got to Rome, but he is really that the link in the chain from the Babylonian oral tradition to North Africa.
You were saying that Rab Hananel was the one who held the different customs from the...
He was the one that brought the oral law to North Africa.
Okay. Yesterday you mentioned there was somebody in Rome Who?
I mentioned that Rabbeinu Hananel, his father. What happened was Rabbeinu Hananel ended up in Rome. His father he accompanied his father on the boat, and of the four captives, Rabbeinu Chashiel Gaon, which is the father of Rabbeinu Hananel. But Rabbeinu Hananel was the teacher of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. So it was through Rabbeinu Hananel, Rabbeinu Hananel lived in Rome. It was through Rabbeinu Hananel that Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi got the oral tradition back from Babylon. So that means Rabbeinu Hananel is really the source to the Sephardi tradition. The Bali Atosos, Rashi's grandchildren, managed to get hold of manuscripts of Rabbeinu Hananel's writings. And that's why he's mentioned there. He is not one of the Bali Atosos. He is earlier than the Bali Atosos.
For Russian.
Yeah. Now, and this is very interesting, because what goes on the Sephardi side and what goes on the Ashkenazi side is that each one is getting from his teacher and his teacher and his teacher. On the Ashkenazi side, there was a change. Rashi had a direct oral tradition that he got from going all the way back to Rabbeinu Gershom, which is going back to the Gaonim in Babel. The Bali Atosos had the manuscripts of Rabbeinu Hanan. They did not just automatically accept Rashi's explanations. They decided for themselves in every situation who they thought was right. Rabbeinu Hananel's side of it or Rashi. In other words, they were choosing between the different oral traditions in their interpretation of every Gemara on the basis of what they felt was right, which they felt really fit best into what it was that they were studying. Remember, the oral law at that point was in the form of the Gemara, the Talmud Bavli. So the Ashkenazi tradition at that point was still in France, it hadn't become Ashkenazi yet. At that point, was not pure in the same sense that the Sephardi one was. The Sephardi was going back to Rabbeinu Hananel and generation after generation, just following the tradition. On the Ashkenazi side, Rashi's was pure, but following Rashi, his sons-in-law and grandchildren got hold of these other manuscripts, and they were making their own decisions as to whom to follow, which they thought was right.
But both sources had clear lineage.
Yes, both had clear lineage, but it was the Bali Atosos who didn't just follow their grandfather. They decided that they would choose for themselves, which they felt would be a more accurate interpretation of what they were reading in the Gemara. Now, all of this continued. All of this continued till the Rishonim, as they are called, the earlier ones. They did something that the previous generations didn't, and that is that they wrote and wrote and wrote. We have more literature from that area, from that era, than ever before. They wrote commentary, they wrote anthologies of halacha, they wrote Jewish thought. There was so much writing in that era. Now, just to understand historically when this was taking place, certainly for Ashkenazi Jewry, there was much persecution. The Crusades took place during the era of the Rishonim. Jewish cities were totally destroyed. Rashi's hometown by the Second Crusade was completely destroyed. That was Worms, which today is Germany, and in those days was still French. Worms, Mainz, Speyer. These are all cities that were filled with Jews, and the great rabbis who continued the oral transmission. It seems like they understood that unlike the previous generations, where students would spend like 24 years or so studying under a rabbi and getting the entire oral tradition, that was no longer going to be possible. There was too much turbulence in the world. There were too many situations of Jews being exiled from their hometowns, and as a result of it, more had to be put to writing. So they wrote. Rashi's grandchildren, the Balei Tosfos, many of them were imprisoned. There is the famous massacre in New York. These were some of the Balei Tosfos who had made it all the way to England, and they were massacred, and then there was expulsion. There were many of them that were in prison, and we have manuscripts that were written in human blood. That was all they had to write. Sorry for being so morbid, but just want you to understand, like, they realized if this is not going to be recorded, the oral law could be corrupted or lost. On the Sephardi side, Rambam wrote extensively. And before him, the Rif, Yitzchak, he wrote Halach as well. So we have a lot of writing from the era of what we call the Rishonim. Now that era came to an abrupt end for Sephardim, Spanish, North African Jewry, with the Inquisition, or the Inquisitions in Spain and Portugal, where the entire Sephardi population had to emigrate. They went throughout the Middle East and parts of Europe. Many went to the Netherlands. Others ended up in France. There it ends abruptly. So we know, 1492 marks the end of the era of the Rishonim for the Sephardi population, for Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. But primarily Spanish Jewry, that was the center of it. On the Ashkenazi side, it wasn't as abrupt. But after the Second Crusade, most of French Jewry fled to Germany. That's how Ashkenazi Jews became Ashkenazim. Ashkenaz is the Hebrew word for Germans, for Germany. Germany is Ashkenaz in the Chumash. It was not easy there either. The first of the Rishonim, really that direct oral transmission in Germany, was from the mayor of Rottenburg. The government began extorting money from the Jewish populations. They learned that Jews give money. The mayor of Rottenburg ruled that they are not to succumb to this extortion, although they were warned that if the Jewish community does not come up with the money, they are going to imprison Rabbi Berkovits himself. And that's what happened. He spent the rest of his life in the Enzigheim prison. It was there that he wrote whatever he wrote. So much so that even after he died, they would not give his body out for burial until it was ransomed, until it was paid for. In fact, to this very day, the person buried next to him in the cemetery is the person that paid for his burial. the person that paid to get his body out. He was not some famous rabbi. He was the donor. Ashkenazi Jewry continued till the pogroms. Early 16th century, much of Ashkenazi Jewry fled to Poland. Exactly when the era of the Rishonim ends for Ashkenazim is unclear. We do have writings that we are not sure how to classify. Primarily the Maharil and the Trumas Hadeshin, just in case you ever run across these names. But with the end of the era of the Rishonim, no longer do we have students studying under a rabbi for 24 years, getting themselves the entire oral law. Instead, we have manuscripts. We have manuscripts of the Rishonim all over the place. This now took the place of live transmission. And here we have another act of divine providence, if you believe in these things. That's kind of hard to deny. It was at that point that Gutenberg invented the printing press. The first book ever printed was Gutenberg's Bible. The second was Rashi's commentary on Chumash. Martin Gilbert claims that there were more Jewish-owned printing presses in the world in those first generations than there were non-Jewish ones. What he doesn't tell you, though, is that most people, other than Jews, were illiterate. We were the only totally literate nation. Because there were no books, so what was there to read? It was Jews, we had Torah scrolls, and every Jewish kid was taught to read.
Were they printed in Hebrew? Like it was.
They were printed in Hebrew, yeah. They were printed in Hebrew. He didn't invent the alphabet, he just invented the technology of printing. Okay, I guess we're gonna